In the past, I made a tutorial for playing chords and melodies simultaneously on the Moog Sub 37 using 8-bit home computer techniques. It's no secret that I love the distinctive sound of an ultra-fast chip arpeggio, which is what the technique relies on to give the illusion of a chord. So, when I recently received Korg's amazing ARP Odyssey reissue, which is paraphonic like the Sub 37, I had to give it a shot on that synth as well. It turned out to be more challenging, but completely possible to achieve a very close sound. Hardware constraints in the form of limited voices were the reason the chiptune chord technique was invented in the first place, and while the Odyssey is a fantastic analog synth, it has very limited polyphony. More limited, in fact, than early computer sound chips such as the Pokey and SID. Further complicating matters is the fact that, unlike the Sub 37, it has no built-in arpeggiator. Now, I could cheat and use an external MIDI sequencer to very easily arpeggiate chords on the new Odyssey, but the original 1972 model came out a decade before MIDI was introduced, so I'm going to stick to what can be achieved by playing live using only the Odyssey. The idea that this iconic sound could have been approximated on an analog synth in the early 70s sort of blows my mind, and I'm left wondering whether anyone put a similar technique to use back then for the purpose of playing chords. I've certainly never heard any recordings of it from that time period. Please let me know if you have. By the way, there is a way to make the filter self-oscillate and then tune its frequency, in effect creating a third oscillator. This technique can also be used to play chords, but the resulting sound is very different from what we're going for here. So, because it has no arpeggiator, we can't fake chords on the Odyssey using ancient home computer techniques, but we can fake those techniques, in effect faking fake chords. We're going to put both oscillators to use. Since both of them will be playing parts of the same chord, we want them to have very closely matching timbres. So, in the audio mixer section, set both VCO1 and VCO2 to the square wave position. Make sure both oscillator levels are high enough that you can hear them, and then adjust their frequencies to identical tunings in their respective frequency sections. Now, also in the audio mixer section, let's turn the volume of oscillator 2 all the way down to 0. Leaving us only with the sound of oscillator 1, which should be turned all the way up to 4. We're going to create a fake two-step arpeggiator for oscillator 1 by setting its LFO selector to square wave. This will cause it to alternate between two values. We want the first value to be the tonic of the chord and the second value to be a perfect fifth up from that. If your LFO frequency is set too high at this point, it can be difficult to make out the pitch interval, so you can always turn it down to a low value in the low frequency oscillator section while tuning your chord. Use oscillator 1's FM LFO slider to achieve the right pitch for our fifth. That's about 2.65 on my slider, but use your ears. Once you can hear the Odyssey toggle between the tonic and the fifth, you can turn up the LFO frequency pretty high until the two notes form more of a continuous sound than separate ones. I like mine between 3 and 3.3. Why are we telling oscillator 1 to play the fifth instead of a third? The reason is simple. If we tune to a third, we're locked into either major or minor and will be very limited in terms of what chords we can ultimately play. But the tonic and fifth exist in all basic triads, so we're safe locking them in. Taking advantage of the Odyssey's paraphonic nature, we're going to get our third using oscillator 2 so that we can switch between major, minor, suspended, etc. at will using the keyboard. Let's turn the volume of oscillator 2 back up in the audio mixer section. Since oscillator 2's LFO selector doesn't have a square wave option, we can't alternate between pitches like we do with oscillator 1. The result is a constant pitch which will sound louder than what's coming out of oscillator 1. Therefore, I find that oscillator 2's volume needs to be a bit lower than oscillator 1's, about 3.5. The last thing we're going to do is destabilize oscillator 2 a bit. The reason for this is that its constant pitch doesn't blend with oscillator 1's alternating frequencies very well, breaking the illusion to an extent. To make this job easier, mute oscillator 1 by turning its volume all the way down. Set oscillator 2's LFO selector to sine wave and turn its FM LFO slider up to about 1.3. This will cause a vibrato effect at the same rate oscillator 1 is alternating tones at, which I find blends the whole thing together much better. Finally, turn oscillator 1's volume all the way back up. Now, the way to make use of all this work is by playing the first and third of your chords on the keyboard. You'll hear a good approximation of a high-tempo arpeggiator faking a chord. You can even play a melody on top of your chord, since oscillator 2 will simply grab the highest note played, which is the melody, while oscillator 1 keeps alternating between the first and fifth of your chord. So you're temporarily swapping out the third for a melody note while you're sustaining it, and then when you release, oscillator 2 will return to filling out the triad with the third. The keen observer will already have figured out that you can substitute the third for any chord note instead of a melody note. Suspended chord notes and extensions work great. Whatever else you layer on top, the tonic and fifth will remain constant. If you manually alternate between the third and seventh, for instance, you can achieve some pretty colorful jazzy results. You can even add a ninth by stabbing quickly with the fifth at the bottom, filling it out with a seventh on top. As for filter and envelope settings, you can play around and see what you like. I keep my settings very basic for this patch because it suits the sound. So I'm not cutting any frequencies, and I keep the ADSR envelope with only the sustain turned up, although some release can sound very good when moving through a chord progression. Please check the photo to see all of my settings if something doesn't sound right. Thanks for watching, and I appreciate your likes, follows, and subscribes.